The photograph began circulating before the applause finished echoing through the ballroom. It showed a man at the center of everything, tailored suit, silver hair, posture perfected by decades of command. Preston Vale stood beneath the lights of a Washington, D.C. policy summit, a billionaire whose presence alone bent conversations and budgets. Around him were senators, donors, executives, power frozen mid-frame. And leaning in toward him was a black Maid. Her uniform was crisp, unremarkable, her head slightly bowed, one hand lifted to his collar, fingers adjusting the knot of his tie with practiced care. To anyone scrolling past it, the image meant nothing. It was hierarchy made visible. Wealth and service. Authority and labor. The kind of picture people absorbed without thinking, because it matched what they already believed about how the world worked. No captions asked questions. No comments lingered. The woman's name wasn't tagged. She wasn't identified. She was simply there. A background figure performing a background role. Inside the ballroom, no one paid her any more attention than they would a passing shadow. Preston didn't either. He stood still as she worked, eyes forward, listening to a senior advisor murmur something about regulatory optics. His mind was already on the stage, on the speech he'd give in 12 minutes, on the delicate balance of pressure he'd learned to manage like a second language. The maid stepped closer. Cameras clicked. Her fingers brushed the silk of his tie, steady, precise. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize for the intrusion. She didn't fumble the way nervous staff sometimes did around men like him. That, if anyone had been watching closely, might have stood out. But no one was watching her. Security scanned the room for visible threats. Executives checked their phones. Guests smiled, laughed, waited for the program to continue. The maid leaned in just enough to finish the adjustment, her face calm, her movements controlled. From the outside, it looked like obedience, another silent act of service in a room that expected nothing more. The photograph captured that moment perfectly. What it didn't capture was her eyes. They weren't focused on the tie. They were fixed on something else entirely. And the reason her hands didn't shake was because she already understood what everyone else in that room did not. This wasn't a routine correction. It was the last safe second before everything changed. Kezia Brooks had learned long ago how to look invisible while seeing everything. It was a survival skill, one honed in spaces where people like her were expected to move quietly, speak less, and never interrupt the flow of power. She'd worked hotels, government buildings, conference centers, places where secrets passed through hallways disguised as routine. Men like Preston Vale walked those corridors daily. As she stood close to him, her senses sharpened, not out of fear, but habit. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when the advisor leaned in, the way his breathing was shallow, controlled, almost forced. Stress, maybe, or something else. Then she saw it. Where the knot of his tie should have been decorative, there was a slight irregularity, too firm, too deliberate. The fabric didn't sit the way silk should, and beneath it, just barely, a glint that didn't belong. Her fingers paused for half a second, not long enough to draw attention, long enough to confirm. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a clip. It was a pin, thin, engineered, embedded with intention. Kezia's pulse didn't spike. Panic wasted time. She'd learned that, too. Years earlier, she'd worked maintenance on a federal complex after a hurricane displaced her family. The job came with training most people forgot the moment it ended. Evacuation phrases, silent alerts, the ways weapons were disguised to look harmless, the kinds of attacks designed to happen in plain sight, surrounded by witnesses who would never understand what they'd seen until it was over. This was one of those. She adjusted the angle of the tie, shielding the device from cameras, her movements slow enough to look deferential. From the outside, it was still just a maid fixing a billionaire's wardrobe. From the inside, Kezia was already calculating exits. She leaned closer, not urgently, not dramatically, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry beyond his ear. "Don't touch your tie," she murmured, "and don't look down." Preston stiffened. His first instinct was irritation. Who was this woman to give him instructions? But something in her tone stopped the reflex before it surfaced. There was no fear in her voice, no deference either, only certainty. She continued, just as softly, "Walk with me, now, like this is my idea." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation could have killed him. Then he moved. Kezia stepped back, gesturing toward the corridor, as if dissatisfied with her work. "Sir, I need to adjust this under better lighting," she said aloud, voice polite, professional. Cameras caught it. Security registered nothing unusual. They walked. Each step away from the ballroom stretched thin with tension. Kezia kept her pace, steady, matching his stride, her hand lightly resting at his elbow the way staff were trained to do when guiding VIPs. As they passed a security checkpoint, she spoke a single sentence, one no guest would understand, one only staff were trained to recognize. "Facilities reports a temperature variance in the East Wing." The guard's expression changed instantly. Within seconds, the corridor shifted from neutral to alert. Radios buzzed. A subtle repositioning of bodies occurred around them, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. They were halfway down the hall when Preston finally spoke, his voice tight. "What's happening?" Kezia didn't look at him. "You were about to die on that stage," she said, "and if you reach for your tie, you still might." They reached a secured room just as alarms were silently triggered. Behind them, the ballroom lights dimmed under the excuse of technical difficulties. Ahead of them, the truth waited, cold, precise, undeniable. And the woman everyone had overlooked had just redirected death with nothing but calm hands and the courage to act when no one was looking. Inside the secured room, the air felt thinner, not because of panic, but because everything false had been stripped away. Preston sat where security directed him, hands flat on his knees, resisting the instinct to reach for his tie. Two specialists worked silently, their movements precise, reverent in the way people are when they know how close they are to catastrophe. The device was removed carefully, sealed, documented. No dramatics, no applause, just the quiet confirmation that if Kezia had hesitated, even briefly, there would have been no second chance. When it was over, Preston leaned back and closed his eyes. He wasn't shaking. That disturbed him more than if he had been. For decades, he'd built an empire on foresight, anticipating markets, predicting human behavior, insulating himself from surprise. And yet the most critical threat of his life had been inches from his throat, visible only to the woman everyone else had trained themselves not to see. Kezia stood near the door, hands folded, posture neutral. She hadn't been asked to stay. She also hadn't been dismissed. In moments like this, power revealed its confusion. One of the advisors whispered that the summit would resume shortly. Another suggested a statement, something vague, something clean. Preston waved them away without looking. "Who put it there?" he asked. Security answered carefully. "We're still tracing it. Internal access is likely." Internal, the word landed heavier than any accusation. Preston's gaze drifted back to Kezia. "You could have walked away," he said. "No one would have blamed you." She met his eyes for the first time, not boldly, not submissively, just honestly. "People like me don't get the luxury of assuming someone else will handle it," she replied. "If I see something wrong and stay quiet, the consequences don't miss me." The room went still. That sentence exposed more than the attempt on his life. It exposed a structure Preston had benefited from without ever naming, the way risk slid downward, how responsibility clung to those with the least protection. He nodded once, not as thanks, as recognition. Later, when the summit officially resumed, no one knew how close the room had come to becoming a crime scene. Cameras rolled, smiles returned, statements were issued. But something fundamental had shifted. Preston no longer stood on that stage believing he was untouchable, and Keziah no longer stood in that building unseen. If this moment unsettled you, it should. Because danger doesn't always announce itself, and neither does courage. And if you've ever benefited from someone's silence, ask yourself whether you'd recognize it if they finally spoke up, or if you'd only notice once it was too late. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. Preston's name never left the news cycle, yet the real disruption happened behind closed doors. Meetings were postponed. Advisors spoke in rehearsed tones. Security protocols multiplied, layered thick enough to smother any sense of normalcy. On paper, everything looked tighter, safer. But Preston felt the opposite. The illusion had cracked, and no amount of procedure could seal it again. Keziah returned to work the next evening, expecting reassignment or removal. That was how proximity to power usually ended for people like her. Instead, she was escorted not to housekeeping, but to a private office overlooking the city. She stood there, hands clasped, waiting for the catch. There wasn't one, not immediately. Preston didn't thank her. He didn't dramatize what she'd done. He asked questions instead, about what she noticed, about how long she'd learned to watch people instead of places, about how often staff flagged concerns that went nowhere. Each answer peeled back another layer of a system designed to look impressive while ignoring the most vulnerable points. He listened more than he spoke. That alone unsettled everyone. By the end of the week, changes began rolling out, quietly. Anonymous reporting channels that actually triggered responses, rotations that stopped isolating overnight staff, security briefings that included people who had never been invited into those rooms before, no press release, no speeches about growth or humility, just action. Keziah didn't receive a medal. She received something rarer, leverage, a permanent role in risk assessment, with authority to interrupt protocols if something felt wrong. Not because she fit the image, but because she'd already proven what she saw mattered. Some executives resisted, they always did. Preston let them. Awareness, he was learning, didn't make you comfortable. It made you accountable. The photograph still circulated online, her fixing his tie, him standing tall. Strangers argued over optics, over narratives they preferred because they were easier to digest. Almost none of them asked the right question. Why did it take a woman everyone overlooked to notice what an entire security apparatus missed? That question stayed with Preston longer than the fear ever had.
And if it's staying with you, too, maybe that's the point. Because recognition after the fact is cheap. The real cost comes when you start looking differently at the people you've trained yourself not to see, and realize how much you've been trusting them with your life without ever trusting them with your voice. So ask yourself, if someone saved you quietly, without permission or praise, would you change anything afterward? Or would you just adjust your tie and move on?
Time passed, but the gravity of that moment never fully lifted. Preston returned to his routines, flights, negotiations, carefully worded decisions, but they no longer rested on the same foundation. The world still treated him as untouchable. Wealth still bent rooms in his direction, yet he carried a private awareness that unsettled him more than any public threat ever could. The system that protected him had nearly killed him, and the person who saved him had done so without authority, permission, or protection. Keziah's presence changed the building in ways no policy memo could. People spoke differently around her, not softer, not louder, just more honestly. She didn't posture. She didn't seek influence. She simply asked the questions others avoided, the ones that exposed how often comfort was prioritized over safety, optics over truth. And once those questions existed, they couldn't be unheard. Preston never framed what happened as redemption. That would have been convenient. He understood now that awareness wasn't absolution. It was a debt. One that demanded payment in changed behavior, not sentiment. He caught himself noticing who was silent in rooms, who hovered at the edges of power, who carried risk without recognition. Each time, it was uncomfortable. Each time, he leaned into it anyway. Keziah didn't become a symbol. She remained a person. That mattered more. She kept her uniform on some days, wore business attire on others, moved between worlds that rarely intersected, and she refused to soften the truth when asked. Safety, she reminded him once, isn't built by the loudest voices. It's built by the ones closest to the consequences. The photograph eventually faded from circulation, replaced by newer stories, newer distractions. But its meaning deepened with distance. What people thought they saw, a maid fixing a tie, had never been the story. The story was about who we train ourselves to ignore and how dangerous that habit becomes when carried far enough. If this unsettles you, sit with that feeling, because it should. Power doesn't just blind. It delegates risk downward and calls it efficiency. And dignity isn't something you recognize after a crisis. It's something you practice before one ever arrives. So here's the question that lingers, long after the headlines move on. If your life depended on someone you barely acknowledged, would you know their name? And if they saved you quietly, without applause or reward, would awareness be enough? Or would you only understand their value once you'd already come too close to losing everything? The investigation never made the news the way scandals usually did. There were no flashing headlines, no names dragged through public courtrooms, just quiet removals, sudden resignations, contracts dissolved without explanation. People inside Preston's circle noticed the pattern. Before outsiders ever could. Influence shifted, access narrowed, certain doors stopped opening for certain men. Preston allowed it, not out of revenge, but clarity. He had reviewed the security footage himself more times than he admitted. Not the device, not the evacuation, the moment before. The way Keziah's body positioned itself without hesitation. The way she placed herself between danger and a man who, minutes earlier, hadn't even known her name. That kind of instinct didn't come from training manuals. It came from a lifetime of being alert because the margin for error had never belonged to her. That truth haunted him. In meetings, Preston began interrupting conversations that dismissed low-level staff as background variables. He asked who cleaned the floors after midnight, who handled access corridors, who noticed what executives never bothered to look at. The questions made people uneasy. They were supposed to. Power preferred comfort. Awareness dismantled it. Keziah didn't stay long after that. She declined offers framed as gratitude, declined roles designed to make Preston feel better about himself. She accepted one thing only: autonomy. A position that gave her authority without stripping her of dignity. Then she moved on, the way people who survive systems learn to do. When she left, the absence was noticeable, not because she had been loud, but because the room felt less honest without her in it. Preston carried that with him. The understanding that survival often depends on people whose presence we minimize because acknowledging them would require humility, because it would force us to admit how fragile our control really is. This story isn't about a billionaire becoming good. It's about a moment when hierarchy failed and humanity stepped in before it was too late. And if that makes you uncomfortable, it should. Because somewhere in your life, right now, there is someone you pass without seeing, someone close enough to notice what you can't, someone whose awareness could save you, emotionally, professionally, or literally, if you ever gave them the respect to be heard. So before you scroll away, ask yourself honestly, who do you overlook because it's convenient? And if the moment came when everything depended on them, would you recognize their worth in time? The unsettling part wasn't that danger had been that close. It was that it had always been close. Preston began to see it everywhere once his eyes adjusted. In hotels, in boardrooms, in private jets, where the same faces poured drinks, cleaned aisles, adjusted lighting, and absorbed conversations never meant for them, but spoken anyway. He noticed how often decisions were made in rooms where the consequences would land somewhere else, on someone quieter, someone assumed to be replaceable. Nothing about that awareness felt noble. It felt heavy, because once you see the structure clearly, you lose the excuse of ignorance. You can no longer tell yourself the system works just because it works for you. You start recognizing how many lives are stabilized by endurance rather than fairness, how many people survive not because they're protected, but because they're alert every second of their lives. Kezia never followed up. No check-ins, no reminders of what she'd done. Her silence wasn't bitterness, it was completion. She had acted, and then she had moved on, the way people do when they've learned early that waiting for validation is another form of vulnerability. That stayed with him more than gratitude ever could. This story doesn't end with applause or transformation arcs wrapped neatly in bows. The world didn't suddenly become just. Hierarchies didn't dissolve. People still overlooked those they were taught not to see. But something shifted, and shifts matter, because they change who gets listened to the next time something feels off. They change who gets believed. They change whether someone's quiet warning is dismissed or acted on before it's too late. If this made you uncomfortable, don't rush past it. Sit with it. Ask yourself who you treat as background noise in your own life, whose proximity you benefit from without acknowledgement, whose awareness keeps things running smoothly while you take safety for granted. And then ask the harder question. If the moment came when everything depended on them, would you see them in time? Or would you only understand their value after the danger had already passed? The building never announced what had almost happened. Meetings resumed, schedules shifted, press releases blamed technical interruptions. To the outside world, nothing had changed, but inside the secured floors and sealed hallways, gravity moved differently. Preston felt it in the way people paused before speaking, in how security no longer dismissed quiet observations as overcautious. A single intervention had cracked the illusion that danger always came from the obvious direction. He insisted on protocol revisions that made people uncomfortable. Not larger budgets or louder defenses, but proximity. Who was allowed to speak? Who was expected to notice? Who was trusted when something felt wrong? Advisors framed it as efficiency. He knew better. It was accountability, and it cost him political capital he'd once guarded obsessively. Kezia returned to her shifts without ceremony. No reassignment to some symbolic role, no staged gratitude. That restraint mattered more than praise. When he finally asked to speak with her privately, she didn't soften her posture or lower her eyes. She listened, then answered plainly. She hadn't acted for recognition. She'd acted because waiting would have been a mistake. Because silence, she said, had consequences. He offered changes, measured, real, expanded authority for staff alerts, training that didn't assume danger wore a uniform, a direct line that bypassed ego. She didn't thank him. She asked if the changes would last when attention moved on. He didn't promise. He committed. There was a difference. The aftershock rippled outward. Board members argued about precedent. Consultants warned about optics. Preston absorbed it and kept moving. Awareness, he learned, wasn't a feeling. It was a discipline. It demanded repetition. It demanded listening, even when nothing dramatic was happening. Kezia watched the machinery adjust and understood the risk of being visible. She set boundaries. She chose when to speak and when to disappear back into the work. Respect, she knew, wasn't secured by moments of heroism. It was secured by systems that didn't require heroism to function. The photograph never resurfaced publicly. Internally, it became a lesson told without names, a reminder that assumptions were vulnerabilities and proximity could be protection or peril, depending on who was trusted. Something unfinished hung between them. Not gratitude, not debt, responsibility, the kind that lingers. Because the next time a warning arrived quietly, the test wouldn't be whether anyone noticed. It would be whether they listened in time. Nothing about the world suddenly became fair. Power didn't soften. Hierarchies didn't dissolve. But something fundamental shifted. Who was listened to and when. Kezia didn't become a symbol. Symbols are convenient. They allow people to feel inspired without changing behavior. She remained what she had always been, observant, composed, unwilling to mistake silence for safety. Preston carried the weight differently now. Not fear, responsibility. He knew survival hadn't come from wealth or authority, but from someone close enough to notice what others ignored. That's the truth this story leaves behind. Safety is often maintained by people we're trained not to see. Warnings are missed not because they're unclear, but because they come from the wrong voice. So ask yourself honestly, if someone quiet warned you today, would you listen? If the person closest to danger didn't look important, would you pause? And if dignity stood in front of you without a title, would you recognize it before it was too late? Awareness doesn't arrive once. It demands a choice. Every time.